Hello and welcome to the Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Now, Fidel Castro, a titan of the Cold War who defied 10 American presidents and thrust Cuba onto the world stage, died on Friday, aged 90. The US government spent more than $1 billion trying to kill, undermine or otherwise force Castro from power, but he endured unscathed before old age and disease finally took him. His supporters in Havana described him as a tireless defender of the poor. Critics say Castro drove the country into economic ruin, denied basic freedoms to 11 million Cubans at home and forced more than 1 million others into exile. Doubtlessly, Castro leaves a legacy that will be hotly debated for the years to come. And we're going to debate the revolutionary leader's legacy on this edition of The Big Picture. Joining me on the program today are former Ambassador Jitendra Kumar Tipathi, Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor, thewire.in, Abdul Nafey, Professor, Center for Latin American Studies, JNU, and also Nilotpal Basu, Central Committee member, CPIM. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with me on The Big Picture today. Ambassador, I'd like to start with you, of course, and ask you about the legacy that Fidel Castro has built and also left behind.
You see, Fidel Castro has built a very good legacy. He has shown the world, firstly, for the first time perhaps, how a tiny nation can successfully resist a big power and its hegemony. How a tiny nation which has got different style of thought can successfully survive on that. So that is something, and he has shown to the world how it is not important to have too many people to have a way or to have a revolution. Only a handful of people can do it, provided they have the dedication. And that is one of the biggest things Fidel Castro has shown to the world. Thirdly, he had shown to the world that though there is a line of thought, there is a particular line of thought, Marxist theory or whatever, but when the time comes, it is always better to make changes. It is always better to show more flexibility in your thoughts and in your style of governing. So that is one thing that he has shown. On the other hand, of course, what he has left is perhaps Cuba is not what it used to be before Castro. Of course, people can say that it was in the lap of USA. But Cuba is opening up, and also we can say that Cuba is the country which has showed to the world that a leader is a true leader if he takes all his populace along.
Indeed.
In his thought of...
Professor Abdul Nafey, would you agree with that? You know, he's a leader who changed with the times and he is the one responsible for, ensuring where Cuba is today.
You know, let me put it this way. His enduring legacies are 2 or 3. He ensured freedom to his people from hunger, from fear, from thugs and death squads who were operating out of the presidential palace. He ensured his people freedom from conservative agrarian interest from the Midwest US, who were heaping all kinds of indignities on the people of Cuba. Number 2, I think his legacy is, he told the Latin American countries, look, there is something called continental solidarity against domination, against inhuman treatment, exploitation. And of course, his legacy is solidarity with all the developing world. And these are his enduring legacies, that they will never ever be eliminated, ideology or no ideology. He taught his people how to live a dignified life, free from fear, from hunger, from exploitation. I think these are the major legacies he left behind.
Siddharth Varadarajan, the flip side to it, of course, is what the American media has been reporting over the last 2-3 days, saying that Fidel Castro was someone who ensured that there was no freedom of expression in Cuba. Anyone who spoke against the administration was persecuted, was prosecuted. Now, these are some things that have been attached to his name as well.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba is a socialist country very much in the political mold of the kind of system that the Soviet Union pioneered, with all its positive and negative aspects. So if you are going to see or look for a political system that is open in the way that in India we understand it, you won't find it. Having said that, the Cuban system has proved to be far more open and far more resilient than any of the political systems in the former Soviet bloc. The political culture is more tolerant and more open than what you saw in the Soviet Union or Hungary or China today, North Korea. These are countries that simply don't compare. But yes, I mean, it is a one-party state, and the kind of freedom of expression that you would associate with a multi-party system doesn't exist in that way. The Cuban Revolution's other achievements are essentially in the social and economic sphere, and somewhere down the line, given the kind of precarious position that Cuba found itself after the revolution, where the United States, pretty much from before the Cubans declared that they were trying to build socialism, the kind of hostility that successive administrations in Washington displayed towards Cuba, in many ways, the US was responsible for the creation of a kind of political system that was more inward-looking and more closed than it ought to have been. So I think that now that you have normalization of relations between the US and Cuba, and the US has decided to end its illegal and criminal 5-decade-long blockade of Cuba, one form of pressure that was exerted over these last 50 years, we hope will now go away. And you may well see a greater openness in the Cuban political system that would have been far more risky for them to undertake had things been the way they were with the US in the past.
Indeed. Nilotpal Basu, I mean, love him or loathe him, he was quite a remarkable character, wasn't he?
You see, first of all, this campaign that has been unleashed, especially by mainstream US media, is really nauseating, because they have no business. This is the man whom they attempted to assassinate for 638 occasions. And all those attempts were illegal. And yet they talk of democracy. So, of course, yes, as I quite agree with Siddharth, it is not the multi-party democracy as we see elsewhere, but definitely after adoption of 1976 Constitution, there is a democracy, there is representative democracy, whereas whereby they from communities, from neighborhoods, they get elected. I have been, and I again agree with Siddharth when he says that it is far more vibrant, far more vigorous, and people participate. I mean, there is a participatory democracy which operates, and I think what is really enduring is that in the backward of United States, you can sustain a system, you can sustain an alternative against all vile attempts to extinguish it from day one. And that could be sustained because of the overall support of the people, participation of the people. And I mean, whatever you may say, if you see the international indicators, I mean, it is not something which Cubans are producing. It is the assessment by United Nations bodies who say that, I mean, in health, they have made kind of progress that even some of the developed nations could not. I mean, see, they have a foreign policy whereby they are saying that we will not send soldiers but doctors and educators. And it has attracted, I mean, therefore, a very widespread admiration.
You know, the flip side to that is, the flip side to that is, people say that, you know, there are critics who say, what's the use of producing doctors and lawyers when there's no food to eat?
I think that is again, I mean, a kind of achievement in social or human development that they have achieved. I mean, Americans have tried this, American leadership has tried this time and again. They have failed, and therefore they continue, and it is only because of the difficult circumstances in which Cuba not only survived, it acted as a beacon for the entire South American region, that you see the kind of solidarity in
Yes.
South America today.
Professor,
no one has ever slept hungry since 1959 in Cuba.
Indeed. Talking about Latin America and talking about South America, like how Nilotpal Basu just brought up, he's inspired some very charismatic recent leaders in South America as well. There's Hugo Chavez, there's also Evo Morales. All these people have been inspired by Fidel Castro.
Many more. Not only these, but many more. For rest of Latin America, Cuba is the symbol of resistance against American domination and high-handedness. In fact, one reason why United States under Obama began normalizing relations with Latin America was this factor. Obama had lost Latin America, one reason was Cuba. Latin American countries had been one. In single voice, they have been saying, normalize relations with Cuba. No more isolation, no more embargo. Summit of Americas failed in 2008 miserably in Cartagena, Colombia. On what? Only on the Cuban question. Latin American countries, whether they are somewhat radicals like Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia, or moderate like Brazil and Chile, or even somewhat more to the right like Mexico and some of the Central American republics, on the question of Cuba, all of them have spoken with single voice in the last 25 years. Embargo must go. Cuba is part of the Latin American community, and this solidarity has been something which Castro had been able to generate. In fact, Castro and his legacy goes back to and reminds one of the kind of vision of a Latin American solidarity Simon Bolivar and others had while emancipating Latin America. The idea was not national freedom, rather idea was continental freedom and solidarity. Castro symbolized.
I will just add, if you see the recent example, the internecine civil war in Colombia, and the process of reconciliation, the way Cubans behaved, the Cuban government behaved as a mediator between the two, and ultimately peace is achieved, hopefully. And therefore, what is important is, in order to undermine this enduring legacy that particularly President Trump and his henchmen have unleashed this obnoxious campaign in the last couple of
Culturally
days.
and historically, Cubans have always been very practical and earthy. Until 1959, Cuba was a playground of Midwestern American interests. Let me put it this way, and to our audience, no one understands US mind, administration mind better than the Cubans. Because Cubans had known how Americans had worked in Cuba before 1959 for almost 140 years.
With Batista
they know them
and
very well.
everyone before that. Now, Siddharth Varadarajan, I want to take you back to 1959. Now, the significance of the Cuban Revolution, would you say that it was a turning point really in recent history?
What's remarkable is how a revolution in one country, barely 90 miles from the United States, that was an accomplishment in itself to, essentially overthrow American interests within such short flying time from the US. But what's truly remarkable is how revolution in this one small country proved to be the harbinger for change all over the world. And I'm saying this with a great deal of responsibility, because there's hardly any country in the world where social movements, political movements, movements for liberation did not draw inspiration from Cuba, did not draw support from Cuba. If you look at the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the struggle against South African and Western destabilization against Angola and Mozambique, the struggle for independence in Namibia, it was the direct Cuban military help to the fighting peoples of these countries that proved to be decisive. And we have Nelson Mandela on the record in 1991 praising the battle, the performance of Cuban soldiers in the Battle of Quito Cornwall in Angola, and how the defeat, thanks to the Cuban help of the military might of the racist South African regime, how this proved to be a decisive turning point in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. So if the Cuban Revolution could leave its impress in distant Africa, you can also imagine the kind of effect it had all over Latin America, where it was a source of inspiration for people, whether in Venezuela, whether Bolivia, the fight against the dictatorships that were the norm in places like Chile, Paraguay, Brazil in the 70s and 80s. So what's really remarkable is how Fidel and the Cuban Revolution in a country so small, were able to have an impact. When you speak of the great icons of the 20th century, we speak of Gandhi, we speak of Nehru, we speak of Nelson Mandela, and we speak of Fidel Castro. And what I particularly admire is how even after he leaves active office, he hands over power formally in 2006, but he continues to remain engaged with global problems, with global issues. His reflections at one point written on an almost daily basis provided really sharp insights into so many global issues which today the world is grappling with, and recognizing that Castro had foresight, whether it's climate change, the danger of nuclear weapons, you name it. So
Indeed.
I think that this is really one of the remarkable accomplishments of Fidel Castro individually, and of course the Cuban Revolution as a whole.
Indeed, taking that thought forward, Ambassador, such a small country like Cuba, 90 miles away from the American coast, there are other islands as well, island nations in the similar region, similar size as there's the Dominican Republic and many other islands, but they could not, impose the same kind of will really as far as other countries and other issues are concerned as Cuba did.
Yes, that is because of their leadership. In 1961 and then in 1962, they stood up, such a tiny country, they stood up and they said no. And that needs a courage, that needs an iron will, which should come from the leadership. And that is what Fidel Castro has shown. Showing this, he had become a source of inspiration for not only the countries, the developing countries of Latin America or the region, but for developing countries all over the world. And that's why he stands in league with Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Nelson Mandela, Nehru. So he has that stature, and this legacy is not going to be washed away or wiped away. It is not that Fidel Castro is not there, only Raul Castro is there, and therefore his contribution, his enduring support, his enduring policies would be thrown out of the wind. No. And USA still knows, and they will still fear Cuba for what Cuba had shown to them, because that has created a precedent in eyes of other developing nations.
Nilotpal, Basu, would you agree with that? Do you think that the legacy is going to continue? Is the legacy going to continue?
I will go a step forward. Yes, leadership, but leadership which has embodied in itself a perfect harmony between theory and practice, without the revolutionary theory. Because you see, Cuban Revolution itself is an enigma. Somebody asked Fidel Castro some time back that today if you had to reenact the Cuban Revolution, would you do with the same 71 comrades that you started your task with? He said maybe with a little less number, but I would have done it exactly in the same. Now this conviction or this vision comes from a concrete understanding of the Cuban conditions, how isolated the Batista regime was, what Professor was time and again referring to as the really gendarme of the Midwestern interest, the oligarchy. I mean, how isolated they were from the peasantry or from the urban folk and the educated classes as well. So he knew precisely that if I can really create that sense that yes, we are going to win, people will rally automatically, even though, because Fidel was not a communist when he was really leading the revolution. He became formally a communist much later. Raul, of course, was a senior in that manner in the Communist Party. So the question is that, you see, leadership qualities, yes, but they were born out of a very, very clear understanding about certain revolutionary ideology, and also intense knowledge of the concrete conditions of Cuba. If you read his historic speech in the Moncada trials, that history will absolve me, that actually became the manifesto of the Cuban Revolution.
Indeed.
You will understand, I mean, how in totality he has summed up the entire Latin American experience. He is therefore a continuation of Simon Bolivar, Jose Marti, and such other heroes of the Latin American fight against Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. So, I mean, it has not just come from thin air. I mean, a proper assimilation of the revolutionary traditions of the region, together with a proper scientific understanding of socialism and the conditions of Cuba and perhaps the entire Latin America, that has produced a leader or a collective of leadership that the Cuban Revolution has produced, of which Fidel, of course, is the finest.
Professor Nafey, who's going to carry this legacy forward? Raul Castro is 85. Raul Castro is 85. There's Vice President Kennel, who Raul Castro himself has said that he's going to, give up power in 2018 to him. So can he, be trusted to take a...
Let's not forget, since 1959, it is Raul who had been regarded as the hardliner. Fidel was more a moderate and a pragmatic. Number two, by now, revolution stands thoroughly institutionalized. In the last 30-40 years, so many times, many names emerged, so and so is going to be the next successor. 3-4 generations have passed. The greatest legacy of Fidel would be that he is leaving Cuba in the hands of people who are politically very mature, who really love their nation. You know what the member of parliament was saying? Here is a leadership which has blended well with the feelings and aspirations of its own people. Cuba is an example, not of so much of socialism. What human endeavor can achieve, Cuba is actually offers us plentiful of lessons in that regard. Food shortage, other crises, but through sheer grit, human endeavor, cooperative effort, you make few things impossible. After all, Cuba continues to produce enough food for itself.
Indeed. Indeed.
And what is wrong in it? If Cuba has surplus doctors, no one says to this day that Cuban doctors are poorly qualified.
Yes.
No,
everyone says they are excellent doctors.
They are all over Qatar, they are all over Venezuela, they are all over the world.
20,000 of them are in Venezuela.
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, several hundred of them are in Pakistan, working free.
No, you see, when this
In rural tribal areas.
Ebola
Yes.
epidemic broke out, I mean, they were the largest numbers. Cuban doctors, Cuban health workers, they died.
But
global medical system is such. Otherwise, Cubans have, to their credit, many inventions in the field of biotechnology.
But he's been
and
criticized
medicine.
also for it. Siddharth Varadarajan, he's been criticized for it. He's saying that that same money could have been spent in Cuba to ensure that the people within Cuba get that money rather than sending these doctors abroad free of cost or, or indulging in humanitarian work.
I think that Cuba the health internationalism or health solidarity of Cuba is a shining example of selflessness in international politics. I don't think that, given the exemplary healthcare already existing in Cuba itself, the sending of doctors to deal with Ebola in Liberia or earthquake victims in Pakistan in any way compromised the living conditions or the health standards of the Cuban people. And I think it's a source of great pride for them that their small country is able to punch so much above its weight compared to richer countries who have far greater resources, but whose contribution to the resolution of some of these problems at the most fundamental level is well below what Cuba is able to do. So I think that this is a debate that every society will have. What's the best way to spend your resources? But I think that if you look at the overall outlook of the Cuban government, and I dare say the Cuban people who share this outlook, which is of the importance of equality, the importance of social justice, the importance of dealing with people's problems. I think that this is not an issue which generates the kind of bitter debate as some people would imagine. I think that there is a great deal of consensus that this policy is the right policy, and that Cuba is better off for having shown its solidarity with countries and peoples around the world.
Indeed. And I'd like to get final thoughts from my guests, because I've got 2 minutes on the program. In 30 seconds, it's not just the public healthcare system, the impressive public healthcare system that he put in place. He also ensured that Cuba was 100% literate, Ambassador.
Yes, he ensured literacy, he ensured public health system, he ensured that there is no shortage of food. Housing, the 3-4 basic needs of humankind. He ensured that they should be taken care of and taken care of well.
Professor Nafey, your final comments in 30 seconds.
21st century will not know that there were giants who lived and shaped the 20th century. And one of them was Fidel Castro. He ranks along with people like Mao, Mahatma Gandhi, Woodrow Wilson, Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, Nehru. These were the fellows who really made wonderful contributions to human progress.
Nilotpal Basu, his contribution to communism, will it ever be forgotten?
Never, it cannot be. And I think I will just mention last point that about racial integration. Today, you have to go to Cuba and see what kind of racial integration. So Donald Trump, who won the election on the basis of racial hatred, will never be able to appreciate Fidel Castro. So Fidel Castro will remain immortal, and his legacy will continue to inspire generations, not only in Cuba, in Latin America, but all over the world.
And Siddharth Varadarajan, final comments from you. Please close the show for us.
Yeah. You know, I think we sometimes forget that Fidel Castro's legacy is a legacy of a man who died at the age of 90, but whose revolutionary life began in his 20s. He was 33 when the Batista regime was overthrown. Who, if you look at that age group, I mean, we're talking of, in India, Shahid Bhagat Singh, who was killed in his 20s by the British colonialists. You had Patrice Lumumba in Congo, who was assassinated because he opposed imperialism. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. You think of the whole range of young leaders who, had they been allowed to govern their people, had they been allowed to lead their people, the kind of transformations that they might have been able to bring in their society. Fidel Castro in his life and Cuba as a living example give a glimpse of what is possible if you have leadership, if you have inspired leadership, visionary leadership, and leadership that is not assassinated or in some way interfered with by the world's big powers.
Indeed. All right. On that note, we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for watching.